Hello, everybody, and welcome to this TBTI SSF Open House webinar. Today, we're talking about where are small-scale fishers, the impact of 30 by 30 on coastal communities. So just going to wait perhaps a couple more minutes for everybody to come in. Got a few attendees, the number's slowly rising, and then we will get cracking. Perhaps while we're waiting, we'll just give some quick overview and housekeeping. So my name is Steve Rowcliffe, and I am a senior technical advisor at Blue Ventures Conservation. My background is fisheries management and community-based marine conservation. And Blue Ventures as a whole is a kind of people-focused conservation organization that works with coastal fishing communities to rebuild fisheries and restore ocean life. And today in this seminar, we are co-hosting with the ICCA. The ICCA consortium is global, and it's a membership-based organization, and they work tirelessly to promote recognition and support for areas of conservation by Indigenous peoples and local communities at local, national, regional, and global levels. So today's session, you'll be pleased to hear that you're not hearing just from me. I can't think of anything worse. Indeed, we have three speakers, each of whom are going to talk for about 10 minutes. And then we have a sort of open discussion for the remainder of the session. And I would like to flag at this point that this is very much about your thoughts, attendees, audience, as much as everyone else's thoughts. This is a passionate and somewhat controversial topic, and we want to encourage an open and free forum for debate. So, as I say, a quick overview before we get cracking. It is going to be, I would imagine, quite a passionate session with differing views from the panelists and from the audience, and between the panelists and everybody else. So I think the first rule here is that we need to be kind. I'm also sure that there will be plenty of questions, and so if I could ask that you please add them to the question chat, not the general chat, that would be wonderful. It gets a bit confusing with these double chats on Zoom webinars. You'll also be able to virtually raise your hand. I think, in the interest of time, because we've got quite a broad topic to get through and a lot to do in a very short time, if you can leave your questions until the end, I mean, by all means put them in the chat, but we'll deal with them at the end when all the speakers have had a chance to chat. And the final thing to say is that we have quite a tight schedule. So speakers, I will be telling you to hurry up. And in fact, I will be told to hurry up if I prattle on too much. So let's try and get through it all. So as I say, we're hearing from three speakers today, and we've got a real diverse range of practice and experience from across the Indo-Pacific. First up, we'll be talking to Tahiri Ranjanjafi Manana. And Tahiri, I apologize profoundly as I've undoubtedly butchered your surname. Tahiri is the National Marine Advisor for Fisheries and Marine Protected Areas from Blue Ventures in Madagascar. Tahiri will be followed by Priska Kratsimbi Zafa, and apologies to you, Priska, of the Mahari network of locally managed marine areas. And then finally, we'll be finishing up with Mohammed Arju, the communications coordinator for the ICCA consortium. And Arju, apologies if I've managed to butcher your name too. But before we get to these wonderful speakers, we're going to spend sort of 5 minutes just setting the scene, really, a quick introduction to 30 by 30 to make sure that everyone here is all on the same page. So let's start very briefly by casting our minds back to 2010. That's the last time a global framework to protect nature was agreed. It was agreed in Nagoya in Japan, in the Aichi prefecture, which gave its name to the Aichi targets. There are 20 of them, and they range from tackling pollution to protecting coral reefs. Now, for those of us here who work in protected areas and allied disciplines, Target 11 is the critical one. And as many of you all know, that is about conserving 17% of land and inland waters and 10% of coastal and marine areas. And as many of you too will know, as the Aichi targets have come to an end, we as the world didn't meet any of them, which is obviously quite a shame. The headline figure for our target of interest, 11, we came pretty close to, but the devil, of course, is in the detail. And if we take marine protected areas as an example, there's about 17,000 of them worldwide, but most of them lack the finance, management, and enforcement needed to be effective. So when it comes to the headline figure of 10%, we got pretty close. But when it comes to the detail of, well, how effectively and equitably managed are they, which the target also calls for, we did unfortunately fall woefully short. So against this background, enter 30 by 30. This is really the latest iteration of a conservation pipe dream, a goal seeking to protect 30% of global land and ocean by 2030. This is a really hugely ambitious undertaking. We're talking about doubling the current land area under protection and quadrupling the ocean area. This would make 30 by 30 the most extensive governance project land governance project in human history. And we're talking about an additional area of land that is about 2/3 the size of Africa to get under protection by 2030, and an area of ocean that is about 3 times the size of the African continent by 2030. The 30 by 30 campaign has broad support and has been, it's funded and coordinated by WIS, and it has the support of many countries across the board and many large organizations and non-governmental organizations, including the Biden administration, of course. And since the Paris Agreement was agreed a couple of years ago, and climate change subsequently shifted significantly up the agenda and got more funding and more attention, there's hope that we will do the same. So in Kunming later this year in China, we're going to have another opportunity for a new global biodiversity framework, of which 30 by 30 could be the center. And there's a hope that this will be a Paris moment for biodiversity that can help the funding start to flow. So that's the good stuff. What about the not so good stuff? And really here it comes down to kind of ecological complexity versus human complexity. Many people, myself included, on this call will be trained in biological sciences, and us ecologists, we're really good at kind of like ecosystem complexity. We're not so good at the human thing, and we've kind of left that to one side and said, yeah, humans, you're a pretty destructive force in general. On the flip side, we have kind of social scientists and human rights activists who are very good at the human complexity and are viewing 30 by 30 with some justifiable suspicion, really, that it could have some potentially quite widespread negative consequences to local communities and indigenous peoples. It's been called by some a new model of colonialism. And I think more broadly, it means broadening the conservation movement's definition of what protection means. That really leaves several questions unanswered. What gets protected? Where? How? Who receives the funding? What does all this mean for local and indigenous communities? And those are some of the issues that we'll be touching on today. So without further ado, I will hand this over and stop prattling to our first speaker, Tahiri. I'm not going to butcher your surname again, Tahiri, you'll be pleased to hear. Tahiri is the National Management Advisor for Fisheries and Marine Protected Areas from Blue Ventures in Madagascar. He's been working in small-scale fisheries for the past 8 years, supporting remote communities to manage their marine areas in Madagascar. He's giving an overview of the potential consequences of 30 by 30 on small-scale fishes in the Western Indian Ocean. So Tahiri, I will duck out now and hand things over to you.
Okay, thank you, Steve. I will share with you my screen. Is it okay?
Yeah, we can see you fine, Tahiri.
Is it okay now?
Yeah, it looks
Can
great.
I start?
Yes, you can start.
Okay.
Please do start.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for introducing me, Steve. Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. I am going to present to you today an overview of the potential consequences of 30 by 31 small-scale fisheries in Western Indian Ocean. And before that, I would like to start this presentation with what 30 by 30 initiative means. It is a conservation goal seeking to protect 30% of global land and ocean by 2030, supported by the vast majority of the conservation NGOs and around 50 countries so far. So this presentation is divided into three main parts. After the short introduction, like background, I want to present the practical challenges of 30x30 implementation. Then I will show you the consequences for communities. And finally, I will share with you the key recommendation to implement this goal in the way I will follow it by conclusion. So this October, the CBD conference will decide the new decade strategy for natures. This will replace IEC Target 11 and others, and is known as 30x30. The IEC Target 11 was agreed in 2010 to conserve at least 17% of terrestrial and inland water and 10% of coastal and marine area through effective and equitably managed, ecologically representative and well-connected systems of protected area and other effective area-based conservation measures. Achieving 30% by 2030 means quadrupling the ocean and doubling the current land area under protection. This ambitious target presents, of course, the challenges, opportunities, and risks for coastal states in the WO. The 3030 proposal wants to address biodiversity loss and climate change, but in reality, this vision will deal with the practical feasibility and consequences to communities. So let's move on the practical challenges of implementation of these goals. To better understand some of the practical challenges 30x30 faces, it is sensible to briefly review progress toward the protection goal, IC Target 11, which will replace. The MPA is increased in coverage through the Target 11 IC around 8% of the world ocean. Let's look at this table summarizing the progress towards IC Target 11 in Western Indian Ocean. We see that the words came close to reaching the headlines protection goal. However, many of the created MPA are not effectively managed because of the speed of increase. We think that the 30x30 target seems to be the same. The public proclamation about the implementation are not clear in terms of the locations of the category, it means the feasibility. For example, the call for the network of a highly protected marine area where no destructive or extractive activities can take place. Others propose a network of protected area covering 30% of the ocean in the high seas. Some argue that the conservation outcomes are at least equivalent to highly or fully protected area. What is the consequences for the communities now with that goals? So beyond the question around the feasibility of a 30x30 proposal, there are fundamental issues concerning the consequences for local and indigenous communities. It was recognized that the local communities play an important role in the effective protection of ocean which they rely on. The local stewardship often proves more effective than government-driven approach. However, these local communities are not involved in the conservation efforts. They are even unempowered and mistaught rights. This ambitious target might have risk in human rights and food security. In its current form, 30x30 is thus both socially unacceptable and operationally unreasonable. We propose a workable solutions to remedy this. It is a holistic community's first approach. The WIO must put human rights and local leadership at the center of efforts to achieve the 30 target. There is evidence that area under community-based management are more effective. We should formally recognize respect and protect the community rights-based management approaches emphasized by FAO and United Nations as fundamental approach and mechanism. It is a community-first approach. We need a long-term sustainable solution by protecting the ocean and securing livelihoods to address the needs of the people and driver of the biodiversity loss. To conclude, 30 by 30 new target is an ambitious solution, but ineffective to the weight problem faced by fisheries and marine biodiversity. It also risks leaving coastal community behind. However, this proposal provides a big opportunity to strengthen the contribution of local communities and a key solution for nature and people. Thank you so much for listening to me. Thank you.
So here, if I could ask you to stop sharing your screen, please.
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for a whistle-stop tour there of the Western Indian Ocean and some of the issues around small-scale fisheries and 30 by 30. I'm sure there's plenty to unpick there, which we can do at the end. So next up, we will jump across to Priska, who is a database officer at the Mihari Network. The Mihari Network basically sort of brings together and coordinates locally managed marine areas in Madagascar. And as Priska will tell you, they've done an extremely good job of that. Her role is to gather and share information on locally managed marine areas to support their effort in sustainably managing marine resources. And she'll be talking today about the role of LMMAs in national marine conservation, specifically in Madagascar. So Priska, it's over to you, and we are bang on time as well. Well done, everyone.
Thank you, Steve, and good morning, everyone. I'm Priska from the Mihari Network, which is the national network of LMMAs, or locally managed marine areas in Madagascar. And today we are going to talk about how LMMAs contribute to the conservation, mainly marine and coastal conservation. Let me share my screen now. Okay. So, yeah, so a little bit of a background to start with, as maybe there are some of us who do not know yet what an LMMA is. And by definition, an LMMA is an area of nearshore water that is managed by the people or communities who live and reside in that area. These communities are mainly located in marginalized and isolated coastal areas, which is the case for Madagascar. And this makes them face great difficulties in many aspects of their everyday life. And so the aim of setting up an LMMA is to sustainably use and preserve the areas and the natural resources while improving the living conditions and the living standards of this population. Now about the Mihari Network, which is the national network of LMMAs in Madagascar. The network aims to mainly advocate for the rights of LMMAs and to strengthen the capacities of these LMMA communities, and also to promote solidarity between them. Currently, the network gathers 219 LMMA communities located in 10 out of the 13 coastal regions of Madagascar. So these Lmma communities, they play a major role in terms of management of the ocean and the coastal resources and areas. And in that aspect, they contribute indeed to the 30 by 30 conservation goals. The Lmma communities are contributing to this conservation of marine and coastal biodiversity and areas through 4 ways. The first is through the government mechanisms that the communities are using. In Madagascar, the management tools, there are 3 management tools that the communities use. The first is the DINA, which is a mutually agreed law defined by the community members. They also use what's called transfer of management of natural resources, where the government formally transmits the governments of the area to the local communities. And lastly, they through the creation of a marine protected area. The Lmma approach is actually an inclusive approach, given that all members of the communities, from small-scale fishermen to women to tourist operators to young people, all take part in the management of their area. And they set up special committees, for example, committees in charge of applying the law within the communities, teams of guards who do the surveillance and patrolling of the area. Secondly, Lmma communities also implement tools to improve fisheries management and production. For instance, they allocate certain parts of their territories as no-take zones where seafood or any natural resources cannot be disturbed or taken in any way, shape, or form. And they also have what's called temporary reserves, where the fish are able to grow and mature before harvesting. They also use fishing calendars to monitor when each species can or cannot be caught. Other than that, Lmma communities also take part in restoration of degraded coastal lands by planting mangroves and monitoring their growth. Some Lmma communities also have their own site peculiarity. For example, some sites are protecting and monitoring turtle nesting sites, and for others, it's about conserving endemic birds territories. And the 4th way that the communities are implementing to conserve marine and coastal resources is by reducing the pressure on these marine and coastal resources through the development of other forms of income-generating activities. It can range from farming fruits, vegetables, or cattle and poultry, farming seaweed or sea cucumbers, and to tourism and making and selling crafts. So as a result of these management and governance mechanisms implemented by the communities, the Lmma communities, with the fact that they became empowered in being part of the Mihai network, these communities were able to get together and make their voices heard. And they asked the government to grant them a reserved fishing zone for small-scale fishers. And in May, the government started to meet this demand, and the Ministry of Fisheries announced that industrial shrimp fishing vessels are not allowed to get closer than 4 kilometers away from the shore. And so this will not only allow for shrimp stock to increase, but it will also allow small-scale fishermen to peacefully fish for shrimp. Through forums and exchanges or exchange visits organized by the Mihai network, the communities are also feel less marginalized and more considered in decision-making regarding the use of coastal resources. They are also able to share and exchange information and knowledge between themselves, as well as collaborate on finding solutions to common problems they might encounter. For instance, the network brought an LMMA from the north a few years ago to visit an LMMA in the south region who was already implementing octopus closure. And at the time, this LMA was producing about 4 tons of octopus a year with the closure. And after the success of this LMMA, the LMA from the north decided they also wanted to start an octopus closure. And a couple of years later, they got even greater results as they produced 15 tons of octopus a year, which is about 4 times even more than the LMA that they replicated the octopus closure from. And as I mentioned before, the LMA communities also contribute to the restoration of degraded lands and areas, planting mangroves. And one LMA from the north actually was able to restore 20 hectares of mangrove sites where mangroves were completely wiped out by mangrove charcoal production. And so all of these show that the LMA approach is effective and it's valuable in achieving marine and coastal resources conservation goals, such as the 30 by 30 conservation goal. Thank you, everyone. And that's the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Priska. That's a wonderful story. If I could ask you to stop sharing your presentation, please. A wonderful story of kind of grassroots success in Madagascar, really. And I think it's, I think I'm right in saying that they're, unlike many areas of the Pacific, where this kind of community-driven management has a long historical tradition of customary marine tenure and so forth. That's not the case in Madagascar. It's all happened rather recently on quite large numbers. So it's a real success story, and hopefully we'll have time to talk more about that at the end. But perfectly to schedule as well, I might add, it's time to take us to our last speaker of the day. So Arju is going to be talking about marine conservation rights and local leadership of artisanal fishers and coastal communities. He is the communications coordinator for the ICCA consortium, who, as I mentioned, are our partners in crime in organizing this session. He's a conservation practitioner specializing in aquatic management. He's a busy man. He leads the social enterprise Saga Seba, and apologies for my awful pronunciation once more. And he also serves as a board member for the Society of Conservation Biology, not only on the marine section, but also on the social science side. So when I talked before about that divide between sort of human complexity and ecological complexity, Arju's got a foot in both complexities. So he's an ideal person to talk about the rights and leadership of artisanal fishers and coastal communities in marine conservation. So Arju, it's over to you.
Thank you, Stu. I'm going to highlight a few recommendations in line with our recently published major global report on the state of indigenous peoples and local communities' territories of life. But before that, let me share a story, or probably stories. For the global audience from any parts of the world, the horrific scenes of deaths and despair that you see in the Mediterranean Sea. And not all the refugees come from war-torn countries in North Africa or in the Middle East. Many of these refugees who are leaving home are from the tiny South Asian country, Bangladesh. But there is no war going on in Bangladesh. Many of these refugees are from coastal areas, from barrier islands, very low elevation coastal zones. I was born and raised on such an island. And many of these desperate people, of course, are climate refugees. And of course, there are other dimensions to that. Most of these people are subsistence and artisanal farmers and fishers, or just young adults from these families who don't see a future in artisanal and subsistence fishing anymore. There are in millions of these people are either losing access to territories, ecosystems they took care of for generations, or the ecosystems are so degraded nowadays by climate crises, sea level rise, pollutions, by overexploited, mostly by industrial scale exploitations, that these communities have very little or almost nothing to eat. We know these communities, like any other tropical oceanscape in the world, as Tahiri and Priska presented. For generations, these areas and territories were governed and managed by these communities in nearshore and inshore areas of Bay of Bengal in Northeast Indian Ocean, like any other tropical oceans. But in the late 80s, something happened. The blue and green revolution happened together in this part of the world. The consequence of marine fisheries enhancement, originally led by international development partners, was that these communities were forced to stop their traditional governance and management in inshore and nearshore waters. Since then, these communities were never asked about what they really need to sustain their food system, what they were doing right, and what they need to defend their ecosystems in the face of new and emerging threats. And since then, this is a really unfortunate story also for conservation, because this enhancement project did not do anything to seek legal recognition for customary tenures of communities. And then now these families on these islands, coastal areas, I will name two of the islands, Maheshkhali and Sonadia. If you just Google it, this is a very unfortunate case in the Bay of Bengal. Many of them are evicted from their homes, lands. They are barred from accessing their fishing grounds by large-scale infrastructure projects, ports, LNG terminal, coal-fired power plant, you name it, all sort of mega projects. And also, and this is the story, by nature conservation projects. One of these islands, Sonadia Island, was declared a protected area of some kind. And these conservation projects, they never asked communities what they needed to sustain these important ecosystems, home to migratory birds, critical habitat for sea turtles, mangroves, and so on. Conservation projects already had a prescription in their hand, that is a protected area. And now, 2 decades later, the government is transforming the island into a big tourism destination. So conservation here, unfortunately, become an accessory to eviction and displacement and forced migration of the most climate vulnerable people among the most climate vulnerable people in the world. And the same thing will happen in other neighboring islands, for example, Nijumdip Island, without any respect to customary fisheries, governance, customary tenure rights, the leadership of fishing communities, without any respect to any of these. Conservation projects have successfully lobbied with the government to establish a marine protected area around Nijumdip Island. And interesting is all these steps, disastrous decisions have been in fact seen as success to fulfill the protected area target of IG biodiversity target. And now we have this 30 by 30. So this way, our experience from all over the world, also we have seen from analysis of the global situation in our last report, ICCA Consortium, a major report on territories of life, that what the conservation is doing in these cases is putting the communities between a rock and a hard place. It's either unsustainable industrial extraction, unsustainable economic activities, industrial fishing, or protected areas that strip these communities from very basic human rights. So now 30 by 30 is another target for protected areas, whether it is 20 by 30 or 30 by 30. I think it is not even relevant to these artisanal and subsistence fishing communities at all. And this is happening all over the world. And I think the real question should be, okay, before going back to the questions, I'm going to share a few recommendations. I hope I have enough time, 1 minute or two, from our recently published Territories of Life report. And I am going to share my screen. Steve, I can't share my screen.
Let's see if one of our technical wizards can share it for you, Arju. And don't worry, we'll give you a couple of extra minutes.
And I apologize for the background noises. We have a
try
lot
now. Try now, Arju. Sorry to cut across you.
Yeah, thank you.
Can you share now? Great.
So we did this report. It's a few years of processes, and we analyzed the global trends about how the indigenous and local community conserved areas are governed, what are the main threats, what are the opportunities in the context of not 30 by 30 just, but the global post-2020 biodiversity framework, and the relevant findings to fishing communities, coastal fishing communities, indigenous fisheries or community fisheries. I think the top one will be, we need to support these communities for self-determination. This is the keyword. I think, inclusive community-based or participatory conservation is not enough anymore, because sometimes those words do not mean anything, because without the right of self-determination, these communities, if you don't accept them as with their agency, with their stewardship, leadership, then inclusion probably some kind of FGDs or other stuff, but not the real thing for the stewardship of these communities. And the way we can recognize legally their stewardship as an agency is that on national level and financial international level, changing and reforming the legal system to acknowledge their customary rights and traditional governance systems. And the second one will be, this is a very big one also, not in 30 by 30 right now, or the current draft that we can see for global biodiversity framework post 2020, human rights is not at the center of it. But this should be. Without human rights at the center of the post 2020 biodiversity network, just the stories I shared with you from Sonadia and Moheshkhali Island, this will be repeated in other parts of the world again and again. So human rights should be at the center of 30 by 30. And of course, in the paradigm of between the rock and hard place, if rock is conservation, hard place is other unsustainable economic activities. And we should rather, the post-2020 biodiversity framework, we think, should be focused on all those drivers of big drivers, large scale industrial drivers of biodiversity loss. And last one, of course, very important, it's not enough that we just recognize legally of rights of communities, but we also need financing, public investment, rather than advocating for a PA that has nothing to do with local needs. We should prioritize how the public investment, the taxpayers' money in those countries or from the donor countries, development partners, goes directly to these communities. And with that, I think I will conclude. Thank you, Steve, and thanks to our participants.
Thanks very much, Arju. I think that's a great way of ending the three presentations with some very practical recommendations and takeaways there. So we've had a fair few questions. We've got around about 15 minutes now for an open discussion. We've had some questions that have come in privately to us and also in the group, but none of you used the Q&A function that I asked you to use at the start. So mark against all of the audience's name for that. But let's kick off. We've got some quite specific questions in the chat, and we'll get to those in a second. But let's kick off with something a bit more broad. I mean, I feel like we spent the last 40 minutes providing an alternative view of 30 by 31 that perhaps isn't the default position in the media and in the broader public discourse. But I want to acknowledge, I suppose, that it has some benefit. So I'd like to start by asking the panelists, is there anything that you like about 30 by 30? Because we've been rather dismissive of the whole thing as a concept. What's good about it, if anything? So perhaps either Arju or Tahiri, you can take that one.
Yeah, I think I could like 30 by 30 because not just protected areas, there's also option for other area-based conservation measures. But there are studies and evidence that achieving other area-based conservation measures or recognizing the indigenous and local community conserved area as part of OECM, oftentimes it also goes against the interest of these communities, and it's also not done. The governments, if you look into the state of the politics and rule of law, corruptions and other irregularities in the tropical countries where the most biodiverse oceanscapes are, governments always go for top-down protected areas. So I could like the portion of OECM in 30 by 30, but I think that's not what practically happens or will happen.
Thank you, Arju. Tahiri or Priska, do you have anything to add there? Any thoughts?
I think what's the most unique with the 30 by 30 goal is that it puts in the center the communities who were being left out for such a long time in terms of conservation, although they are the ones who really matter the most, because if we conserve marine and resources, it means nothing if communities are not considered in these processes, and they also have the best knowledge and know-how since they've lived there for generations and generations. They have the best knowledge in how to better manage the resources or how to preserve them.
Right. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Tahiri wants to say something.
Yeah. Thank you, Steve. I think with this 30 by 30 goal, I think it is really important to have this the goal like this one, because we recognize that we need to address the biodiversity loss and also the climate change. But in terms of the practical feasibility, I think we need to review and to think about how to implement these goals, because sometimes these have the risk for the community, because I'm not sure if it is like a top-down approach, but it is like we need the community also to involve in this goal and how to implement this in reality, and to think about the practical and the feasibility. Thanks.
So yes, essentially it's taking all that wonderful, that simple concept of let's protect 30% and working out how to actually do it. And I think Arju had some good broad recommendations at the end there that can help in that endeavor. Sorry, I'm cleverly muted myself there. Let's move on to perhaps another question. Priska, I wanted to ask you, you touched upon it in your presentation, but one of the questions that we had was, do you see LMMAs as a solution to achieve 30% protection of coastal waters in Madagascar?
Yeah, so the short answer to that is yes, of course, because if it didn't work, we wouldn't be promoting this approach. The reason why this is effective is, as Tahir kind of mentioned before, people are more willing to take actions towards conservation and marine resources preservation if they know it's going to benefit them, if they know how it is important in their lives. And the Lmma approach really takes that side of empowering communities in understanding how preserving their natural resources is going to affect their lives. And we have seen, actually, we have seen a lot of changes since the creation of the network. For instance, people are less willing to use destructive fishing gears. And yes, there are still many cases of use of those types of gears, but people are, the local communities understand that it's not good for the environment, it's not good for them, it's not good for the seafood that they are catching. And more of them are willing to join the team of guards, the patrolling teams, to fight against these wrong practices.
Wonderful, thank you. I did have one other question for you as well while I've got you. There's been a couple of people that have asked about the level of compliance with LMA rules in Madagascar. So you talked about the DINA, and you touched upon it in your answer just then, but is compliance generally high? Is it better than you'd see in a government reserve? Does it vary from site to site?
It's varying from sites to sites because some sites have their community members who have been residing there for a long time. And in those types of communities, the application of the DINA is better because the DINA is mutually agreed between the community members. But in other sites where there are lots of migrants, either from immigrants, either from the other coastal areas or from inland, in those sites, the application of the DINA is much more difficult because those immigrants are not complying with what the local communities have set up, the rules that the communities have set up.
Thank you. That's a very illuminating answer. We'll jump into the chat box because I know there were a few questions that came through specifically in there. Some of them are quite narrow and technical, but we'll deal with them now, and then we can kind of talk about some broader stuff as we get towards the end of this session. So, Tahiri, there was a question for you about the indicators that are used to assess whether an MPA is successfully managed. Is that something that you would like to comment on?
Yeah, I think for the MPA is expected to operate under many different conditions like socioeconomic, governance, biological. But if we need that the MPA is effective, so we need some different indicators within these different conditions. Like, for example, in the biological, we need that the species abundance, habitat distribution, but in terms of the governance, we need also that how much the community participate in decision making. Is there the structures? It is like governance body to manage the resources, and is it effective? And how they manage the resources, and they have the right to manage these resources. And sometimes we have also some in terms of the socioeconomic and the household income, because it is really important that that the MPA is designed also to improve the income for the community in which they rely on. Thank you.
Thanks, Tahiri. I think that's a really good overview of the kind of the things that we would more broadly as scientists look for to make sure that an MPA is biologically and socially and economically effectively managed. I don't have the IUCN criteria to hand, so I may be well wide of the mark in this. But Renee, in answer to your original question, I think it's largely based on whether or not there is a management plan and active management in place for the IUCN indicators. And the problem is that, of course, that most MPAs don't have that, and most LMMAs, aside from places like Madagascar, are often quite informal, and they progress. And when we do research, we find that they're having biological and social positive impacts, but they wouldn't necessarily. They fall short of that standard, so they could be effective, but not in that number. But equally, it really highlights the fact that most MPAs are really just paper parks that someone's drawn a line on a map somewhere and doesn't really have any active management or enforcement or finance. Okay, so moving on, there's another question in the box. Yeah, we're going to jump on to Arju now, because I feel like we've left you a bit, Arju. I'm sorry. So we're going to come back to you now for a second. You talked a lot about climate change stuff, and we'll get back to that, I think, if we've got time. But do you interested to know, or someone's been interested to know, do you view biodiversity conservation through protected areas as always conflicting with the rights of indigenous communities? You know, if it's biodiversity conservation that's done by communities and with communities for communities, then presumably that's okay, or would you always favour sustainable use?
And thank you, Steve. So, you know, I think the question I would like to answer, you know, we had this protected area, the total conservation paradigm is actually built upon forest conservation, the colonial practice of resource exploitation, and then enclosing area from the natives. And overall, there were some efforts of good practices by many conservation groups positively, but basically it didn't go very far from that. So my question will be, why you already should have a prescription decided mind that you need a protected area and then come to communities to discuss? Why not it is like all this traditional governance, indigenous governance, other governance and management system that are alternative to Western's neo-colonial or colonial conservation paradigms? Why don't we ask indigenous peoples and local communities that how they were doing it right and what they need to sustain and defend their territories? Only the answer to our biological, ecological crisis and climate crisis is something that was thought like 100 years ago, and not considering the other models of sustaining and defending these ecosystems. I think this is problematic.
Okay, thank you for that, Arju. We have got like another minute or so before we need to wrap up. So are there any final brief closing comments that any of the panelists would like to make, like a pithy takeaway from any of you three? It would appear not. A resounding silence from all of the panelists. Well, okay then. So I think we'll just wrap things up. So I'd like to thank firstly all of our fearless panelists. This kind of thing isn't easy, especially when we're not all in the same room. We're in separated by vast kilometers. I think so. If we could, give the panelists a kind of like virtual clap, that would be wonderful. Also, thank you to everyone behind the scenes at ICCA, BV, and TBTI to make this happen. to make my mutterings even vaguely competent requires a small team of people sat in the background fielding questions and all the rest of it. So thank you to all of them. Thank you to TVTI and Rasina for hosting us for this week. It's been a blast. And finally, thank you to all of you lovely audience for coming along and listening to us, and for being polite and interested throughout. So thanks very much. We'll see you in the next one.